Hey guys, it's Kromdar, back with another commentary video for this week. Today we'll be looking at Mists of Tirna Scithe plus 15, where I'll be taking you through the key pulls and strategies for the dungeon. Here you can see the talents and conduits that I'm using for this week. This week can be particularly rough for Disc Priests, so the key talents to have are Shadow Covenant for massive extra Shadowman healing and Shining Force for the knockback on these annoying spiteful mobs. If you're looking for tips to help you out with Grievous, check out my guide on my channel or through the link in the description below. Let's get to it. To give us a slight edge, we actually start clearing Mythic 0 all the way to the stat mushrooms. In fact, if you pick up these stat mushrooms on M0 and then start the key immediately, you will still retain their effects for the start of the dungeon, which actually last up to 10 minutes. This is especially useful for fortified weeks because, as you know, the trash is actually the biggest issue these weeks, so 10% bonus main stat for the entire party is really actually quite useful. Our strategy here is the key holder picks up the mushroom and runs all the way to the start of the dungeon, and then he gives us a countdown through voice as to when he's gonna drop the key, so we pick up the mushroom right before, and then we start the key. As you can see here in the top right corner, I still retain my mushroom buff. We open the gate with a Knight Fae from our group, which is either a druid or a mage. These days, I'm pretty sure lots of classes actually go either Kyrian or Knight Fae. The first pull is the 2 patrolling packs. Here, we like to use Ursol's Vortex from the druid, as well as the trees. Those help keep them in place and avoid them from jumping around. It's important to notice that when tanks such as Demon Hunters jump into the middle of the pack, perhaps even without defensives up, they will immediately go down to about 20 or 30% health. Most of the time they can heal themselves up at first, but they will need your attention quite quickly. And here our positioning was a bit off, especially mine, and I actually got blocked off by the Spiteful Shades there. And our tank actually started going ahead when I was out of position. So in my opinion, this is how a lot of troublesome pulls begin, when in fact either the tank goes too quickly or the healer ends up being out of position for pulls. And naturally the positioning is even more stressful this week as there is Spiteful that can occasionally start chasing you, you maybe go in the wrong direction, and that's how you can set yourself up for a very poor next pull after the Spiteful. This pack isn't too problematic. IPI my druid on the pull, it's important to avoid the frontals. I also like to help out with the overgrowth, which targets a random member. For example, here you can see our druid getting channeled and I'll be getting him out slowly. This week on Fortified, that overgrowth also deals a lot of damage in the process, so that people need to be topped off, especially the person who gets channeled. But overall this pull is relatively easy. We're quite experienced with it at this point and it's not a big problem. Perhaps eventually in the future we can start pulling the 2 packs at first, at the start, and this pull all together, and that'll save us a lot of time. The only problematic mobs in this pull are the Soul Cleavers, which actually apply a dispellable debuff to the tank, which increases his damage taken by 40%. So that needs to be dispelled immediately, and you need to keep in mind that occasionally they apply it in intervals, so you actually need to delay your dispel so that you can dispel both of them at the same time. So we skipped the previous pack. You can skip it with Mind Soothe quite easily. You can also Rogue Sap or Demon Hunter Incapacitate. Hunter's Trap doesn't work for it, and neither does Polymorph. And this next pack is also relatively easy. Also has 2 Soul Cleavers, as you can see there. They were lucky to apply their debuff at the same time, so I can just immediately dispel it. Most tanks don't have an issue surviving it immediately, but if it stays up for a long time and they run out of defensives, they can actually start taking some serious damage. So here my prio is just dispelling the tank and keeping people up. The next pull is probably the most problematic in the whole dungeon if you're not ready for it. Our strategy is to open the Knight Fae cache, but avoid picking up the mushrooms at first, since as you can see we still have our 7-minute buff running, so you don't want to overlap it as it does not stack. The Drust Bot Breakers cast random brambles throughout the fight, so those aren't an issue, those just need to be avoided by the whole group. The other problematic cast is the Thrash, and they actually cast Thrash, as we found out, when they reach 50% health. So if both of these are triggered at the same time, it is pretty much a wipe on hierarchies. that is very, very difficult to heal on fortified. Especially because right after this, you have Prideful coming, you have Grievous taking here, and overall it's just a problem. So our strategy here is to pull them into the mushroom room and focus the skull down first. So we only have to deal with one thrash at a time. And this way, as you can see, it really isn't a big issue to heal. Overall, this pack becomes quite easy if you just single target them one at a time. Unfortunately, we've tried it, you cannot pull them apart, you go into combat with them automatically, with both of them, so that's just something you have to deal with. If the group isn't aware to not split DPS on them, then that can be a bit problematic to heal. If you're healing lower keys, a Rapture, a well-placed Rapture beforehand can be really useful for these guys, but unfortunately it's very difficult to stack because of the brambles. You can also use the mushrooms to actually full heal yourself, which is actually quite useful in this room. In the problematic thrashes, you can ask your party to full heal themselves, but that shouldn't be a problem if it's coordinated. We end up clearing Pride here too. On higher keys, Prideful starts requiring some DPS or a healer cooldown. So personally, I am feeling very comfortable with keeping my boon for Prideful, and I'll pop it at the start or at the end, and boon followed immediately into Radiance is most of the time more than enough to full heal my party unless something else is going on. And now we go into the first boss, which is relatively easy. If this is pretty much a DPS check. You need DPS to phase him quickly enough so he starts taking 100% bonus damage, at which point you need even more DPS to kill him as quickly as possible. At this point in a 15, I think we 2 or 3 phase it, but we pretty much always focus on the secondary ad. One of the ad's abilities is a frontal, so the tank has to face it. It's not a problem for the healer or the DPS usually, unless they stand in front of it. And here, as you can see, we phased. I go ahead and power infuse my druid, who just starts going to town on the main boss under Prideful and Time Warp. We actually popped Time Warp slightly before, because the debuff on the boss I believe lasts only around 14 seconds, and Time Warp is naturally a 40-second cooldown. So it's beneficial to perhaps not overlap it immediately with when the boss is debuffed. And as you can see, our druid is just doing absolutely massive damage because he saved all the cooldowns for the boss, and he brings him down relatively easily. I believe even in this scenario, when the boss is low, no, actually in fact here we start focusing the boss. Since the boss has less HP than the ad, our strategy most of the time is just to finish the boss. In fact, in these cases, when we decide if we should focus the ad or the boss, we look at their HP totals. But you need to keep in mind that the ad phases at 20% HP and not at 0% HP, so that has to be considered. It's also important to remember that if the ad is not killed fast enough, the boss will start taking around 75% less damage, so if it is mistimed, then you can be setting up for a very catastrophic boss pull, where he'll be taking 75% less damage and you'd have to switch to the ad. For the maze, we like to mark the mist color with a skull to see where he's going. Occasionally, you actually can keep track of him throughout the maze and you can sort of see where he's going even after the first exit. But sometimes that's tricky, so actually after the first one, we usually just decide to focusing on solving the maze. As you can see to the right, you already can see the Mistwhale Defender and the pack on the right basically, and occasionally if Mist Color goes right and you see it, I like to pull that other pack too on top of this pack, because the 2 Mistwhale Defenders by themselves are really not problematic, and it actually saves a lot of time to clear the 2 packs at the same time. Unfortunately for this week, the Spiteful Shades keep you in combat, so we are actually unable to walk through the gate after the mobs die. You have to finish off the Spiteful Shades, so you may as well not wait for them to despawn. Since we saw at the start that the Mist Color went straight, we don't need to solve the puzzle. We just decide to skip it immediately. On these packs, again, I know that my tank can sometimes dip on the first hits from the mobs as they do it at the same time. And I actually just pre-dome. I know where he'll be landing and I pre-dome that location so that his first hits are reduced by 25%. Usually it is the healer's job to solve the puzzle, so I try to do it, but this week this is one of our first 15s that we're doing, and I just decide to pay just a bit of extra attention to my tank so he doesn't get wiped, as it is also grievous and occasionally some mobs here can be problematic. But usually it is indeed a healer's job to go around and solve this. Usually the tank should be able to survive the trash packs inside every segment of the maze, but luckily here my group is helping me out, so it's not an issue. For each one of these packs we try to use at least one cooldown, so it goes down relatively equally. Here, as you can see, my mage got bitten by the fox, and on a 15 fortified it starts doing quite a bit of ticking damage. Every tick is around 30-35% of his HP. So this is the point where I'm unable to start solving the maze. I kind of have to pay specific attention to people who got bitten. There my druid also starts going down. And if you let Grievous go out of control and neglect the tank, these pulls can become a very big problem, in fact. But overall, we didn't find them too difficult. Again, as a disc priest or any class on fortified weeks, I am generally against holding cooldowns. The only cooldown I'm really holding is the Boon of the Ascended for the Prideful, which is coming up on the next pack. Overall, Mists is a pretty easy dungeon this expansion. Even fortified, the trash does have some abilities, but they're not that big of a problem to deal with compared to some other 15s. Here the Mistveil Stinger applies a magic debuff to a random party member. If you don't dispel that debuff and you let it expire, it will kill the party member on this difficulty. On lower difficulties they might survive with low HP, but as the debuff is ticking it does nothing. So as long as it's dispelled in 6 seconds, which is more than enough time, it does nothing pretty much. And this pack ends up going directly into Prideful. The biggest problem we had here is the Spiteful Shades. They start chasing around, and at the start of Prideful it can get chaotic, as you will see later in the video. We start struggling with one of the Pridefuls because of that. But luckily for this one, I keep my Boon of the Ascended into Radiance, and as you can see my party is nowhere near going into even Grievous zone, and the ad is already at 50% HP. When my Boon is out, I like to just DPS a bit until I can no longer do that, after which I Radiance into Shadow Covenant and just start spamming Shadow Mend, which does about 10k healing, and then my Twist of Fate procs too, and that's even more healing at that point. Shadow Mend has been very useful, as you can see there. I was at 27k crit with Twist of Fate and Prideful combined, so Shadow Mend starts doing some very serious healing when needed. It can occasionally be difficult for your DPS to time their cooldowns for the boss, because the maze segments aren't always consistent. Sometimes you can have one extra segment, sometimes you can have one segment less. So again, here we just like to use DPS cooldowns on cooldown, and as you can see there, my mage has pressed delete on this pack. He absolutely demolished this pack with power infusion and Prideful buff, so we didn't have to think too much about it. And here in fact I even start solving the puzzle a little bit, and I managed to solve it, saying that it's circle. For the pulls, if the DPS is calling out that they have DPS cooldowns and the tank has defensives, you can freely run around and solve the puzzle. Unless something goes completely out of control, it should be easy to recover from. Another tip I like for disc priests here is, if you are pressured to solve the puzzle, I would just Rapture and solve the puzzle, run around in Rapture and just apply the shields, as you don't need to stand still to apply shields. You can just keep solving the puzzle and spamming shields on your party members, or maybe on the tank who's getting demolished by the trash. After all my runs in this dungeon, in this particular room to the very left, I've never seen this room lead to the boss. Every single time it has been the gate, which I'm next to right now. Let me know if you've seen anything else, but I don't think this puzzle even needs to be solved. Pretty much always it is this room. I know the week is going to be over soon, and we only have about 2 days left of Spiteful, our most favorite affix, and Grievous, our second most favorite affix. Unfortunately, they're going to be gone next week, but perhaps if you can avoid playing with melee, that's gonna save you a few nerve cells. Playing with melee this week is very rough, because Spiteful can just go onto them immediately. And my rogue, despite being a very good player, he's doing an amazing job controlling the entire pack, and he's not often on the DPS mirrors that high because he's spending a lot of energy, in fact, crowd controlling the whole pack. he gets hit by Spiteful quite a lot, even with his awareness, so it's not even as much up to the player's skill. Sometimes it's just very difficult to see what's going on. And this is one of these scary pulls where we have a lot of Spitefuls up, even some trash left from the previous pull, and the Manifestation of Pride is already up. So this can become very, very hectic. We're running away from Spiteful, and as you know, if you're running away, you're very likely to get hit by the swirly from the Pride. Here I start clutching it out with Boon of the Ascended into Radiance, which does quite a bit of healing, but despite that, we had to spend extra DPS to kill that, and Prideful starts going up to 20 here, which is very scary territory, especially for Disc Priests. And luckily, Shadow Covenant helps me out a bit, but on the last little tick, I end up dying. Fortunately, that's just, if I hadn't taken the Spiteful hit, I would have survived this. That's likely the case. So again, this is a death pretty much to Spiteful, not to Prideful. But luckily we have a Druid who topped off everybody with Wild Growth and a res on me. And I think here we just immediately go into the boss room, because this is almost always a boss fight after that room. We luckily have some Prideful up still. PI on the mage, we try to do as much damage as possible to the Mist Scholar, dodge all the projectiles, except for the mage there. He decides not to dodge them, he decides to stand still and face tank it. And again, it's been late and we've been tired, mistakes happen, everyone can forget to dodge a swirly, especially if you're full focusing your DPS rotation, and mages do have quite a tight DPS rotation inside Combustion. For the Illusionary Vulpin, we always have a CC up. We call it out in voice comms and CC it. Pretty much everybody can CC it. If it spawns next to me, I like to fear it immediately, and I try to stay away from melee, so I avoid spawning it in melee. My DPS ends up calling out which copy should be focused, so I just let them focus on that. In fact, me personally, what helps me the most is not focusing on finding the right target, but focusing on my party's health, because they will start dipping quite quickly, especially this week, and Grievous will start stacking them quite quickly if the ad stays up for long. Sometimes there's also the dodge overlap, so it is actually very important for me personally to keep an eye out on the main boss and my party's HP, as opposed to finding the correct copy and pop some cooldowns. For example, here I pop Rapture in order to avoid dipping too far low on the healing. As a recommendation here, I would definitely pre-Rapture his phases, because again, the shields from Rapture stay up to around 15 seconds each, and they can crit, so you can potentially look for crits to crit on the entire party with massive 20k shields, and the pulsing damage AoE ad will still eat through these shields, so it's really not an issue if you pop it early in the phase, and then you can just start DPSing. And again, here there's a third phase. He phases for the third time at around 10% HP. I top people up with some Radiances into, I believe, Shadow Covenant in a second. Yes, there it is. Shadow Covenant has been so nice this week. It does absolutely massive healing, and it also does an instant cast healing on the entire party for around 5 to 8,000. So it's been very helpful. Towards the end of the pull, we're starting to struggle a bit, even with Prideful. I'm very low on mana, but luckily we make it through. In terms of mana management this week, definitely, and always, not just this week, stock up on mana potions. The instant cast ones, I always have at least 100 in my bags. I use them on cooldown. They've saved my life a million times. Absolutely also have healing pots. Healing pots and mana pots don't share cooldown, so I really like to use these pretty much on cooldown when I'm feeling even slightly in trouble. In addition to that, there's obviously the Druid Innervates. Those are massively useful when I know I'm about to start the Shadowman spam under Shadow Covenant. I just immediately ask my Druid for Innervate, so I don't waste any mana. Shadowman spam is very mana intensive, so if you can skip these phases of mana intensity, it becomes much easier. This pack is relatively easy. The only important mob here is the Staghorn. He casts the shields and regeneration. We have both melee interrupts assigned to that and range to back up if anything happens. The other adds target random party members with a dot, which is relatively easy to top off. There, I believe my rogue takes a tick from Spiteful, the favorite affix. He especially is liking it a lot. I remember him complaining last week that he hated last week. He had no idea what was coming to him this week. The dot overall from the previous mobs is not difficult to heal. It's not like the bleed from the foxes in the maze. And this is the trash pack that we just like to melt pretty much. They go down very quickly to our rogue and our mage. And here I think our mage is complaining that he didn't get to do enough damage because the rogue actually took care of the small ants too. And I even PI'd him. What we found actually, if for some reason you're unable to skip a pack at the start, you will trigger Pridefuls in very, very bad spots here. So I think if you don't skip any packs at the start, you will trigger Prideful somewhere in the middle of this pack, and that just becomes a nightmare. One very, very major piece of advice for anyone running the scheme, not just healers, is try to skip the pack that we've skipped at the start. That pack pretty much always needs to be skipped, I believe. There's also a very problematic Thrash boss there, Thrash mob. There's absolutely no arguments for not skipping it in my head. Another min-maxy thing that we like to do here is skipping one of the Pridefuls. The way you do that is if you kill the last boss before you spawn the last Prideful, you will actually finish the dungeon before you even have to start fighting the Prideful, saving you good 20 or 30 seconds. So this is especially viable in this dungeon because there are only 3 bosses. So as you can see here, we shroud past a lot of mobs, we're right next to the last boss. We attack these gorgers to spawn the Prideful. On the weak aura, if it's glowing red like that, you can actually see if the Prideful is about to spawn. My druid actually got zoned out by these little brambles there, and he had nowhere to go, and he actually got one-shot by the ability, on 15 at one-shots. Luckily I have a combat res. If you are a disc priest, this expansion professions don't really matter. The only profession that really matters is engineering, because having a combat res up is very, very, very useful. And we've actually underestimated this Prideful. With Spiteful spawning, there's massive damage going out. From the very start, we still haven't taken care of all the ads. There's absolutely ridiculous healing required for this ad. Especially with Spiteful, with people running around and taking occasional hits. There we got unlucky, and my rogue actually was targeted by the Spitefuls. He also took a few hits, so here I believe I end up going down if I'm not mistaken. Again, this Prideful overlap was just horrible. It was an absolute nightmare. And I believe here I ask my druid for a heal convoke. If druids actually get out of boomkin form and they convoke in human form, they will end up healing quite a bit. As you can see, he's done around 170 healing in this pack. So that's massive healing from his ability. And unfortunately, we're quite tired at this point, and the mage ends up going for the second time during the pull. But that's fine, we keep most of the Prideful up, and we go into the last boss on the 4th Prideful. This boss in my head is both a strategy and a DPS check. He has some annoying abilities. For example, there is a parasitic interrupt there that needs to be done, as well as the interrupt during his channel. Mind Link, for Mind Link, we just like to be spread out relatively far, but not too far, so I can heal people. We like to blow all cooldowns on him, because if he takes a long time, he'll become problematic. If you kill him quickly, he is quite easy, really. The ads that he spawns fixate on one random party member, and if it fixates on me, I actually like to run into melee in order to allow my rogue and my tank cleave them for me with Elysian Decree and Blade Flurry. The boss will also attempt to predict where you're moving with his abilities, and here in fact, since we all stacked up together, he attempted to predict the movement of around 2 other people next to me, and I end up mispositioning myself and getting one shot. And as we see, we don't have any more combat reses, so we just decide to run out of the boss room and reset him. My druid is still alive, so he can actually res me, so I can res all of us again. Luckily, this dungeon is quite forgiving on the timer, so fortunately we still have another go at the boss, and we try to time this key. An alternative strategy here, if you wipe on the first time, you can actually clear the rest of the trash and get the last Prideful. We decided not to do that here. We're confident we can do this boss at this point. We have around 6 minutes left on our timer, and that was a strategy for this run. it ends up being quite close. I think in terms of speed that you gain from the DPS boost versus the speed of you killing the Prideful, it is relatively the same. Without Bloodlust, it doesn't make that big of a difference. Combined with Bloodlust, maybe we could consider killing the last Prideful first. So again, here we try to spread out the Mind Link, try to separate as quickly as possible. Even by separating as quickly as possible, there's quite a bit of AoE damage going out. There is also some larva in melee. So overall, this boss, depending on the abilities he uses, can become quite chaotic. He has cooldowns on his abilities, but he will not necessarily cast them immediately when they're off cooldown. Here your job is really important to top off the party members so they don't go too deep into Grievous. Stack up. Here, as you can see, I'm stacking up with the small adds on melee. I end up getting hit by them quite hard, and luckily I have Power Infusion on myself and on my party member. I believe that's Rogue who's clearing them for me. And we clear the adds and we go back into our normal positions, far away from each other, but close enough so that I can heal people. If possible, I like to send my predicted blasts from the boss into other puddles, so that way we don't flood up the room. But here, luckily, we don't have a lot of issues with the puddles overall, and even without Bloodlust and Prideful, on Fortified, the boss goes down relatively quickly for a group who is at this point relatively well equipped. We actually are Heroic only guild, and we still haven't cleared Heroic. We're progressing at our own speed, but most of our gear is obtained from either Mythic Plus or PvP, so at this point I believe we're at around, on average, 207 item level. And there my mage gets hit by the predictability. I decide to start rapturing in order to prevent some extra damage, but we see the boss is already dead, so we just kind of lose all sense and decide to finish him off. Luckily we make it through. So again, the most important tips for this boss: separate far enough from Mind Link, and you can actually see who the boss is targeting for Mind Link when he casts it, so you can kind of have a feeling for which way you're supposed to start running already. Try to stack up the predicted blasts on top of one another so you avoid flooding the room, and try to actually not move too much, because if you move too much he will predict it in the future to perhaps land on a melee or something, or on another ranged, and that can be quite problematic. And 3, try to stack up on your cleave friends if you're targeted by the ants. If that is done cleanly, it is really not a big issue. And at this point we still have around 2.5 minutes to clear some trash. We have to keep in mind that even if we spawn Prideful, we don't have to kill it anymore, so that's a big time save for us. And at this point we just start pulling some of the more problematic packs in this dungeon. Again, on this pool there's a stack horn, we have 2 interrupts assigned for that. We just kind of, at this point, it's that common feeling that you're not sure if you're gonna time the key or not. It's kind of close, but at the same time you're really feeling it, so the tank starts pulling very quickly, and that's where a lot of mistakes can actually start happening, because the tank is neglecting the rest of the group. As you can see here, my mana is starting to dip a bit, but luckily I still have some mana potions, so that's not an issue. We also have the inner raid from the druid. Again, if the tank decides to pull the wasps here, which are menacingly floating in front of my screen, they always scare the crap out of me, then that can become an issue. This week the wasps are actually quite problematic, especially if you don't have a poison dispel. Without poison dispel, it is difficult. Luckily, I've asked my druid beforehand to just cleanse poisons to the maximum for me, and I asked my party for defensives if we're out of poison dispels too. But overall it becomes relatively smooth, the poison dispel, and very rough without one. And the last pack with a stack horn, just 2 interrupts needed. At this point we have 1 minute left to kill this pack. We are in really no trouble. We don't even need to kill the entire pack, so we just focus target 1 or 2 of them, and the pack, along with the dungeon, ends up going down. Again, relatively easy dungeon. If you're ready for some spicy trash pulls, for some bleeds to be healed off, not a lot of direct damage going out here, it is a lot of that consistent single target damage. Bosses, there's some AoE going out, but overall, really not a problematic dungeon. If you're looking to get into Mythic Plus, I would definitely recommend starting with this dungeon, who requires some tactics in addition to DPS and healing. and Halls of Atonement. Right, that's it for my plus 15 Mists of Tirna Scythe run. Hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.